Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Roundtable here at the Center for Post-Christendom Studies. We're glad to be together again today with Stuart Macdonald from Knox College at the Toronto School of Theology and Brian Clarke from Emmanuel College, the Toronto School of Theology, and to talk with them about their book, Leaving Christianity, Changing Allegiances in Canada Since 1945. If you were with us for the first segment, you heard me talk about what a great resource this is for understanding the shifting place of the church within Canadian culture. And I think it has spin-off effects for those of you who might be watching from places outside of Canada, but perhaps in places where the church has changed in terms of its place and relationship within culture. So we're glad to be together with you guys today to continue this conversation that comes out of more than a decade worth of intense research that went into the development of this book. So we were talking earlier about, again, some of the decline and changes within people's religious identification within Canada, and we were talking about the fastest growing group, as I understand it, of people who identify their religion as none, as no religion. So let's talk a little bit more about that. As you maybe drilled down a little deeper into trying to understand this phenomena, what were some of the things that you discovered that perhaps you didn't know before you started this project?
One of the things we discovered, and we mentioned this in the first half, but it bears repeating, that nuns had been fairly small, consistently under 1% of the Canadian population before 1961. So we do know how many there were. It was a tiny group, 4% in 71, but then it's continued to grow. And the other one thing that we discovered is that as we looked at this, we realized that with the expansion of time, there were people in that group who had never gone to church. So the first group of people would be people who have some kind of religious identity. But really, as you go along, there are people who can't even remember what the family was. And I think we're starting to see that more and more, even when we do funerals, for example, of people who've been faithful in the church and they've been there. And they come, but their children don't even know the basics of what it is that their parents or their grandparents were. Yeah. And so we can see that the generational part of it is one aspect that I think is interesting. But one of the other things we discovered is that there are more people disconnected than the no religion indicates.
Yeah. So there are several trends going on here. I mean, one of them is that youth are increasingly joining no religion. If you look at no religion right now, in 2011, about a fifth of those who are no religion are under 14. Most of those are being brought up in households that are also no religion. Right? So their parents may have disengaged from organized Christianity, but their children have never engaged. So there's a significant proportion of the population now has never had any exposure to organized Christianity. The other thing that's going on here is that the category of no religion itself is the proverbial tip of the iceberg. There are other census categories that we came across. We had never heard anyone talk about them before. Two of them are Protestant, not otherwise specified, in other words, people just, what's your religion? I'm Protestant. And then Christian, not indicated elsewhere. Again, the vast majority of those respondents are people who said, in response to the question, what's your religion? I'm a Christian. Now, when it comes to that category, many people have assumed that must be people, who might declare themselves to be born again or what have you. Maybe some sort of evangelical descriptive. It doesn't look like that's the case. We actually got a look at some of the more or less raw data from StatsCan, and the number of people who said, I'm born again is it's tiny. It's not even statistically meaningful. Yeah. So the vast majority of people who act, when you look at the category Christian, not indicated also, the vast majority of people actually just said Christian. That's what they wrote down on the form. So who are these people? Well, what's really interesting about them is that they're young, they're urban, they track east to west, In other words, it starts low in Atlantic Canada and keeps increasing,
Right.
and of course is largest in BC.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do these people actually look like in terms of their demographic profile? They actually come pretty close to no religion. It matches up fairly closely. Now, we're not saying all of these people are, close to, would self-identify
Right.
that way. But what we're saying is that probably most of them are probably not engaged in organized Christianity.
Yeah.
The same thing with Protestant, not otherwise specified. They tend to be rural, white, and older.
Right.
Now, if you're asking a middle-aged person, what's your religion, and they write down Protestant, I'm willing to wager that means that they don't have a very strong feeling about their religious affiliation.
Yeah.
I think that, I would think the probability is not very important.
Yeah.
Since they're not going to say anything more specific than that. So this is probably some sort of cultural memory rather than an active identity that would lead them to be engaged in some sort of organized form of Christianity.
So in a certain sense, they're almost functionally no religion.
That's right.
Though they might check a box.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But when you add it up,
Yeah.
this is a significant number. In 2001, you're looking at about 700,000 Canadians who wrote down Christian. Another 500,000 wrote down Protestant. But third idea, that was 1.25 or so million Canadians, and it keeps getting larger.
Yeah.
When you get to 2011, the Christian not indicated elsewhere is about 1.3 million,
Yeah.
approximately. The Protestant ones are down a little bit, but still about 450,000 people. So that's significant.
Yeah. Very much.
And if if you roll that into the functional equivalent of disengagement from organized Christianity, the numbers start adding up,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you start at 7.7, 7.8 for no religion. You add another 2 million,
Sure.
2011. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
the numbers.
So, yeah, and then you start thinking about even those people who said they're Anglican or Baptist or Lutheran or whatever might not be engaged in a church. So those who have no monthly, let alone weekly, connection to a Christian community are much larger than the 24% of no religion. So I think that's something that we just have to recognize. And the challenge is if people have no religious memory, most of the ways of engaging those that Canadian churches have developed assume those people have at least some foundation.
Right.
So you have to rethink almost everything you've done about bringing those folks into your church.
Yeah.
And that's a situation we haven't dealt with.
And I think that's probably one of the things that again the book really helps church leaders think through is sort of some of that. And and you guys talk about it, and if again the numbers tell the story too, that's the game changer, I think, right? Is that this is almost like we're in a generation, we're in a time now that we've never known before in Canadian history in terms of Christianity and culture, the church and culture, where the church could always count on being able to draw from some kind of religious memory or experience, maybe some rough belief that was still there, and you could at least tap in maybe.
Yeah.
So now we're in a time where that's increasingly less true.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about that. I know as historians, you're not usually expected to predict the future, which is a kind of comfortable sometimes, I'm sure. But nonetheless, I'm gonna, as those who have immersed themselves and really discern sort of the situation as it is. What are some of your hunches, your senses, in terms of where things are going? Is there a way you can talk about that based on what you've learned from doing this project?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The one thing that people sometimes go to is if things are bad, there will not be a church. Or one of the things people go quickly to is there's no Christianity left in Canada. We're not saying that or suggesting that that's going to... We believe the church will continue to exist. But will it be smaller? Yes. Will it have to rethink its institutions? Yes. I think one of the things we realize is that some of the denominations have more physical buildings than they will need in the future. And so that's one of the things we are and will continue to see is church closings. And that will be just one of those factors that's really fascinating. The form of a church or a congregation on the ground, what it actually looks like, though, will be very interesting. I think for Anglicans and Catholics, there's a way of being that will continue. But for many Protestant churches, they've been very free in their worship style and their way of organizing. What are they going to look like? I mean, that's a question that I don't have an answer to. But I think those denominations are really going to have to think about that. What is going to meet the needs of the religious people they minister to? And Sunday mornings, what do you do if half of your folks are involved in work? And you no longer have the culture setting that day aside. I don't think every church has even begun to think through what they do related to that.
Yeah. Do you is there with that is looking forward? You kind of, as we talked about this idea of nuns. Is it fair to say it's the biggest chunk of that are younger people that while maybe some older people, in our first segment, Brian, you talked about the 65-year-old Quebecer who no longer identifies as Catholic, and there is that, right?
Yeah.
But it's still largely this trend of the younger generations who are the ones who are identifying in this way, and because they literally truly are those who have no religious sense of in their upbringing and tradition.
Right, that's certainly what's going on. But there's other things going on as well. I mean, just to backtrack, this trend began with the baby boomers. They have, as some of them switched from being something to being nothing, that keeps going, that segment keeps growing as they get older. Not smaller. So one of the things now, of course, is that the baby boomers are now turning over 65.
Yeah.
Right. So it's becoming a multi-cohort, but also multi-generational phenomenon. Right.
So it's becoming increasing across generations. Yeah. Interesting.
If you map what happens to be from a cohort as they get older, they increasingly switch away from something to nothing.
Yeah.
And when you look at younger cohorts, increasingly, they start as nothing. So to get back to the point I made earlier, the increase in no religion from 2001 to 2011 was 2.9 million.
Yeah.
That's a result of a number of demographic things happening. People as they aging, switching out, and younger people not being raised. Not being exposed to organized Christianity. So this is a fundamental long-term trend.
Yeah.
When you look at these kinds of numbers, they don't change on a dime.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. They just because the demographic momentum is just so huge.
Yeah.
So that's the future.
Yeah. So let's just maybe wrap up with thinking a little bit. So I appreciate it. You obviously are trying to be clear that the church has a future.
Yeah.
But maybe it's a little different kind of a future. So we talk historically. We've looked at some of the and that's history is an ever evolving story, right? So where in this do you find hope or we kind of say, okay, like in some ways we could say this is a kind of a gloomy story and for those of us who participate in the church and still care. But is there places that you see, is it the matter of just changed expectations? Is there other places where you would say to church leaders, here's my word of encouragement, here's my word of hope to you?
Well, I think it does start with changed expectations, because you talked about the fact that in the 80s you imagined things would grow. That was the expectation. Yeah. But there was a reality that had already shifted, and we weren't sure where we were. Yeah. I think what we've tried to do is provide a map of where we are. Yeah. Now we know this is the reality. Now how do we function in this reality? Now we know where we are. How do we start thinking? So for me, the hope is that we finally have begun the process, and we're not the only people who are going to contribute to this, of realizing where we are and then starting to make the adaptation. So I think that's one key thing. One other thing for me, and this is not as a historian, but as a person of faith, I think what it takes us back to is faith. That what's going to make the church grow is not the coffee hour or these other programs, but actually engaging and talking to people about why they are following Christ.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that at times churches across the theological spectrum have lost sight of within Christendom. And so I think losing Christendom in some ways forces us to go back to the basics. So that's where I find hope.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key point.
Yeah.
Christendom is over, not coming back.
Yeah.
And I think for the churches that's liberating.
Yeah.
Right, because we can start asking the question, okay, so what does this mean to be authentic disciples of Christ? What does it mean to walk the faith?
Yeah, I'm reminded of Max Dupree, who's now gone, but was a leadership guru for many years, wrote many books, and he talks about the first act of leadership is to define reality.
Absolutely.
And that's in that is actually a very positive, no matter how, whatever the reality might be, good, bad, or ugly, you have to know your reality, and then you can work with it. And your book, this book, Leaving Christianity, Changing Allegiances in Canada since 1945, I think contributes mightily to the Canadian church defining its reality and understanding some of the truths about where we find ourselves. And I think, again, those of you who might be watching from other countries, not in Canada, can find that the story of Canada, understanding that can actually contribute to maybe you understanding your own country story and some of the places, some of the realities that the church in most, if not all, of Western culture currently finds itself in. So thank you, Brian and Stuart, for joining us again today, and also for the work you put into this project that, as I said, helps inform leaders in post-Christendom cultures, helps inform us and helps us understand the reality that we find ourselves in today. Thank you for joining us today on the roundtable here at the Center of Post-Christendom Studies. We appreciate you and look forward to you joining us again in future roundtables. Thanks so much.